They found Commander Dara Voss on the floor of the forward observation post with a hole in her skull the size of a thumb. Not a wound, an aperture. Clean-edged, cauterized smooth, as if the bone had simply been moved aside and set back into place by something that understood the architecture of a human head better than any human surgeon alive. The medic who found her said later that what scared him most wasn't the hole. It was that she was breathing, slow, steady, eyes open, tracking the light, alive in every measurable way, and yet so profoundly absent that checking her pupils felt like shining a torch into an empty house. The Vathi had taken something. What they'd left behind, the Alliance Military Tribunal would spend 6 months arguing about. Voss had been the senior intelligence officer at Karaveth Station, a deep rock facility carved into the mantle of a moon that had no official name, only a catalog number and a strategic designation. She had access to every human asset in the Karaveth system, encryption keys, relay frequencies, the names and covers of 11 embedded operatives in Vathi-controlled space, the location of the secondary munitions depot that officially did not exist. If the Vathi had wanted her dead, she would have been dead. The hole in her skull was not cruelty, it was methodology. They had needed something she carried, and they had taken it with the precision of surgeons harvesting an organ, leaving the body viable behind them. What none of them understood yet, what would take weeks to surface, was what the procedure had also left inside her. The transport back to Karaveth Station took 3 days. Voss slept for most of it. When she was awake, she was cooperative and lucid in a way that made the flight surgeon deeply uneasy. Not because she said anything wrong, but because she answered questions a half-second too quickly, as if she were reading from a transcript of a conversation that hadn't happened yet. She ate whatever was put in front of her. She drank water. She asked, once about a woman named Saris, a name that appeared in no personnel file and matched no known contact in her network. When the surgeon noted the name and circled back to it later, Voss looked confused and said she didn't remember asking. At the station, she was placed in a medical observation bay and subjected to 12 hours of scanning. The neurological team confirmed structural integrity. No edema, no hemorrhage, no measurable degradation of the frontal cortex or the temporal regions associated with memory and language. Whatever the Vathi had done, they had not damaged her. The aperture in her skull had already begun to knit, bone cells proliferating at a rate the chief medical officer flagged as anomalous but non-threatening. Dr. Yeva Chanel, the station's head of xenobiology, was the one who understood what she was actually looking at. She requested a meeting with Voss alone. She brought coffee in 2 mugs, a small human gesture that Voss registered with a flicker of something across her face. Gratitude and something else, something older, like recognition of a ceremony she had witnessed performed by different hands. Chanel set the mugs on the table between them and sat. She did not open a tablet or a recorder. She just looked at Voss for a moment, the way you look at something that has come back changed and you are deciding whether to name the change out loud. "How are you sleeping?" Chanel asked. "In segments," Voss said. 4 hours, then awake, then another 2. I don't remember dreaming, but I wake up knowing things I didn't know the night before." She wrapped both hands around the mug. "That's what you're here about. Tell me what you know." Voss was quiet for a long moment. Outside the observation bay's single porthole, the moon's surface stretched away in sulphurous yellow. "There's a sound," she said finally. "Not a sound I can hear with my ears, more like a resonance. It's there when I wake up and it fades when I've been awake long enough. It carries images sometimes. A corridor I've never been in. A specific quality of light, blue-white, very cold, flat angles. And a name." She paused. "Garrett Vaux. I don't know if that's a place or a designation or a person." Chanel wrote nothing down. "Go on." "There's a sequence," Voss said. "Steps, almost. Like a procedure I've run 100 times, but in a body with different geometry. I can feel where the hands go, what gets pressed, and in what order. I don't understand what it opens, but I understand that it opens something, and I understand that it was left unfinished." She looked up from the mug. "Someone started it and didn't get to complete it. That's what I feel, the weight of an unfinished task. Not anger, just unfinished." Chanel looked at her for a long time. "The aperture in your skull matches the insertion profile for a Vathi neural archive interface. It's a procedure they perform on their own command cast when a carrier dies in the field. The knowledge base transfers to the next designated officer. The memories, the training, the procedural sequences, all of it. Living backup storage." She turned her coffee mug a quarter turn on the table. "They performed it on you. We don't know if it was intentional. or if you were available when their designated carrier was already dead. Either way, what's in your head right now is what was in the head of a Vathi command cast officer. Voss did not flinch. She had known, on some level, for at least a day. And you want to know if I can access it. I want to know if it's accessing you, Chanel said. There's a difference. And I need to know which one we're dealing with before anyone higher in the chain of command decides the solution is to put another hole in your skull and call it a day. That was the first honest conversation. It would not be the last. The memories came in order, though not the order of time. They came in the order of urgency. The things that had been most pressing when the original carrier died arrived first, vivid and specific, while older material surfaced slowly the way sediment rises after a ship has passed through still water. Voss began keeping a record. She wrote in whatever she could find, sometimes on actual paper when the act of pressing pen to surface seemed to help anchor the images before they dissolved. She wrote what she saw, what she felt, what she understood procedurally, even when she didn't understand what the procedure was for. The corridor she'd seen in the first dream was a transit route inside a Vathi deep structure facility. She knew this the way you know the layout of your childhood home, not because someone told you, because you've walked it in the dark. The blue-white light was standard Vathi illumination in their command tiers. The wavelength calibrated for their visual range, uncomfortably bright for human eyes, but navigable. The procedure she could feel in her hands was a security bypass. Garetvo was a designation, an installation name, she thought, though the full word kept slipping when she reached for it, like trying to remember a word in a language you spoke fluently as a child and then abandoned. She told all of this to Chanel. She told it in their daily sessions, quietly, methodically, and Chanel logged it all without apparent alarm, which Voss came to understand was itself a kind of generosity. The thing that frightened her was not the foreign knowledge. The thing that frightened her was the foreign grief. Because the carrier had been grieving. That came through more clearly than anything else. Not the circumstances, not the object of the grief, but the texture of it, the specific weight of carrying a loss that had not yet been acknowledged by anyone who would recognize it as real. It was a grief that had unfinished work attached to it, something done to someone the carrier had cared for, something that should not have been allowed to stand. She found herself at night hating specific people, people whose faces she had never seen but whose designations she knew, not in language, in the way you know an enemy's face in a nightmare, by feeling rather than description. She knew their roles in a chain of command that had ordered something that the carrier had, found unforgivable. She started calling him Vo, because Garrett Vo was what surfaced most often, and she needed a name for what was inside her, and it helped to treat it like a person rather than a contamination. Vo had been young by Vathi standards. She couldn't map the biology precisely, but the emotional register of his memories had the quality of someone who had not yet calcified, who still felt the difference between what should be done and what was done, and who had been horrified when those two things diverged. He had seen something. He had known something. And then he had been killed before he could act on what he knew, and the protocol designed to preserve his knowledge had selected the nearest available consciousness. The unconscious human intelligence officer the team had been in the process of processing, and deposited itself there as cleanly as a letter slipped under the wrong door. Voss thought about that a lot. The randomness of it, how close it was to nothing, how she might have woken up simply missing a piece of her own mind rather than carrying the ghost of someone else's. On the 40th day of her observation, she asked Chanel to bring her a Vathi interface terminal. Chanel looked at her for a very long time without speaking. Then she said she would need authorization from 3 levels of command above her. Voss said she knew. Voss said that she believed the installation designation she'd been carrying in her head was a weapons depot. Not the kind that stored munitions. The kind that stored policy. The kind where decisions got locked away until they were needed, encoded in hardware that could only be opened by a specific command sequence performed by a specific command cast carrier. She said, "I think I can open it. I think that's what Vo was trying to do when he died." The authorization took 11 days. In that time, Voss ran the sequence in her head 40 or 50 times, feeling it out the way a locksmith feels out a lock in the dark. She was not afraid of getting it wrong. She was afraid of getting it right and finding something inside that she wasn't ready for. She was afraid of what Vo had known. She was afraid that the grief she'd been carrying would turn out to be proportional, That the thing done, the thing unforgivable, was as large as the carrying of it felt. It was. The installation decoded into a policy archive. Chanel had two linguists, a xenobiology specialist, and the station's chief cryptographer present when Voss worked through the interface, reading the sequence from somewhere behind her own eyes, her hands moving in patterns her own brain had never learned. The terminal responded. The archive opened. What came out of it took 3 hours to parse and 2 days to verify, and it was, in the words of the cryptographer, later quietly, after everyone else had left the room, the kind of thing that ends wars. Or starts them, depending on which side you hand it to. It was a record of what the Vathi command tier had authorized in the Karaveth engagement, not a battle record, a decision record. Every order, every classification, every authorization that had allowed specific things to happen to specific populations in the outlying settlements that the official record categorized as cleared, which was a word that, in the original Vathi administrative language, meant something between sanitized and erased. Vo had been present at some of those decisions. He had recorded them, annotated them with his own assessments, flagged them with a designation that the linguist translated, after a long pause, as roughly, "This must not stand." He had been trying to get the archive to a Vathi opposition faction. He had been killed before he could reach them. What he had left instead, what he had left inside Voss, in the wrong mind, in an enemy mind, in a human mind that had no reason to care about Vathi internal politics until it found itself caring very much about them. Because grief does not ask for authorization and it does not check passports. It was everything he knew, every access sequence, every facility layout he had memorized, every name in the chain of command from the decisions in the archive, all the way up to the tier that had signed off. A roadmap. A complete, inherited, involuntary roadmap drawn by a dead soldier who had wanted justice badly enough that even his knowledge had refused to die quietly. Voss sat in the session room after the archive closed. Chanel sat across from her. The linguists and the cryptographer had gone. The coffee mugs were on the table again. Chanel had developed a habit of bringing coffee to difficult conversations, and Voss had come to understand this as a thing that mattered, the small human insistence on warmth when warmth was not strictly necessary. "You're going to want to act on this," Chanel said. It was not a question. Vo wanted to act on it, Voss said. "I've been trying to figure out how much of that is him and how much of it is me." She looked at the closed terminal on the table. "I think the answer is that it doesn't matter anymore. I know what I know. It's mine now. You can't unknow things." She picked up the coffee mug. "He trusted the wrong carrier," she said. "I'm going to try to be less wrong." The operation that the Alliance Authorization Committee eventually approved. After another 3 weeks, after Voss had submitted 17 documents and sat through 9 review sessions and answered the question, "Can you be sure the Vathi neural archive is not directing your actions?" so many times she could recite her own answer in her sleep, was not the operation Voss had proposed. Hers had been smaller, more surgical. 3 insertion points. Use the facility access sequences Vo had carried. Reach the 2 living members of the command tier who had signed the specific orders, extract them for testimony before a tribunal that would have the archive as evidence. What the committee approved was larger. They saw the facility layouts, and they saw something other than justice. They saw vulnerability. They saw that the access sequences Voss carried in Vo's memory were not just keys to one door, but a skeleton key to the architectural logic of the entire installation. The Vathi's security design relied on the assumption that only a Vathi command cast carrier would ever hold those sequences, and a human body with Vathi knowledge metabolized into it was something their systems had no protocol for. She was a biological anomaly that the security architecture had never been designed to refuse. She was not a threat that their sensors were calibrated to detect, because she was not a threat that their threat modeling had imagined possible. Voss read the operational brief and understood what they were actually authorizing. She was not naive. She had been an intelligence officer for 11 years. She knew what a strategic asset looked like, and she knew she had become one. She spent a night thinking about Vo, not the grief, not the procedural knowledge, but the person, the quality of his attention in the memories, the way he had annotated his own observations with a care that suggested he understood that evidence mattered. That the difference between a thing witnessed and a thing recorded was the difference between something that dies with you and something that survives. She thought he would have been angry about how she was going to be used. She thought he would have understood it anyway. The insertion team was 5 people: Voss, 2 combat specialists, a signals officer, and Chanel, who had argued her way onto the team with a stubbornness that Voss found she respected enormously. Chanel said she had no intention of sending Voss into a Vathi installation while relying on anyone else's ability to recognize if the Vathi neural archive started overriding her decision-making. Voss said there was no way to be sure she'd recognize it herself. Chanel said, "No, but I've spent 8 weeks learning what you look like when you're you, and that's something." The transit took 4 days in a vessel with a Vathi transponder signature that had been acquired during an earlier operation and was believed to still be valid. Voss spent the 4 days in the kind of focused stillness that comes from having a very specific task and no ability to perform it yet. She ran the access sequences. She walked the facility corridors in her mind. Vo's corridors, her corridors. They had stopped feeling like separate things some time ago. She thought about the woman named Saris, the name she had spoken in the transport on the way back from the observation post, the name that appeared in no personnel file. It appeared in Vo's memory. Saris was someone he had lost. One of the settled populations, one of the cleared. Voss did not know her face. She knew the shape of Vo's memory of her, the warmth of it, and the specific cold hole left behind when the warmth was gone. She thought, this is what's specifically human about grief. Not that we feel it. Other species feel it. She'd read enough xenobiology to know that. But that we carry it into rooms it has no business being in, and we act on it there. We don't quarantine it. We metabolize it, and it becomes fuel, and we are slightly insane about this, and it is, in the long accounting, why we are still here. The facility was exactly where Vo's memory said it would be. The transit approach was exactly what his knowledge predicted. Voss sat at the signal station as they moved into range, and she felt something she could only describe as alignment. The sensation of a procedure begun months ago by different hands finally continuing, the sequence resuming from where it had been interrupted. She thought of Vo not as a ghost, as a colleague, as someone she had never met and would never meet, who had trusted her accidentally, and to whom she owed, at minimum, the completion of what he'd started. The first checkpoint, a sensor array calibrated for Vathi biological signatures. Voss had understood from VO's knowledge that the array used a dual verification system, biological profile and archive carrier status. The latter transmitted via a low-frequency electromagnetic pulse emitted by any active Vathi neural archive interface. She had an active interface. It had been in her skull for 3 months. When the array queried the ship, the pulse it received was genuine. The array returned clearance. The second checkpoint, an identification protocol requiring a procedural response sequence transmitted in a specific neural transmission format. Voss sat in the signal's chair, closed her eyes, and let Vo's knowledge move her hands. The transmission went out. The response came back, recognized. The irony was not lost on her. She was being recognized as Vo. The system that had been designed to prevent exactly this kind of penetration was treating her as the legitimate continuation of a carrier it had known. Because in every way the system cared about, she was. She carried what he had carried. She knew what he had known. The system had no instrument for measuring the species of the carrier, because the species of the carrier had never been relevant before. The combat specialists breached the secondary access port with a tool Voss had described to the engineering team from Vo's memory of the facility's maintenance infrastructure. The port was exactly where she had said it was. The tool worked exactly the way she had said it would work. She heard one of the specialists, a rangy woman named Kell who had said almost nothing for 4 days on the transport, say something quiet and emphatic under her breath that sounded like either prayer or profanity. Both were appropriate inside, the blue-white light, cold and flat-angled, exactly as she had seen it in the first week of dreams. Walking those corridors with her own feet felt like the end of a sentence that had started in someone else's mouth. Channel walked beside her and said nothing, which was what Voss needed. Not reassurance, not instruction, just the warm mass of another human being in the cold light. The archive room was not guarded. It had never needed to be. Its security was the assumption of impossible access, the lock that has never been picked because no one has ever had the right hands. The terminal interface required the same sequence Voss had run 11 weeks ago in the medical bay. She ran it again. The archive opened again. This time, the signals officer attached a full extraction array and pulled every layer, not just the policy records, but the communication logs, the operational authorizations, the secondary files that cross-linked to facilities in 3 other systems. All of it. Everything Vo had found and everything the policy archive had collected since his death. The 2 living members of the command tier were not there. They had moved. Voss had known they might. She had told the committee this. The committee had approved the operation anyway because the archive was the primary target, and the archive was here, and the archive was now in the extraction array. And the rest, the accountability, the tribunal, the formal record of specific decisions made by specific entities who had believed those decisions would remain classified. The rest was a process that had now been made possible when before it had been impossible. On the way out, Voss paused in the corridor outside the archive room. The blue-white light hummed around her. She stood still for a moment, the way you stand still in a place you know you are leaving for the last time. Not because it was good, but because something happened there that deserves a moment of acknowledgement before you close the door. She felt Vo's knowledge settle. It did not disappear. She understood now that it would not disappear. The procedure was not reversible, and she had stopped wanting it reversed. What she felt was something she could only call resolution. The sensation of an argument that has been going on in a room finally coming to a conclusion. The raised voices quieting, not because the issue was abandoned, but because it was finished. The unfinished thing was finished, not perfectly, not completely, but the door that had been stuck was open, and what was behind it was now in the hands of people who could move it forward. She thought, Vo, I didn't know you, and I won't pretend I did. You were the enemy by every formal classification, and I would have detained you without hesitation if we'd met before any of this. But you were trying to do something worth doing, and they killed you for it, and your knowledge ended up in the wrong mind, and here we are anyway. Here we are anyway. The extraction went clean. The transit out was quiet. Chanel sat beside Voss in the aft compartment and didn't ask questions, which was the specific quality of company that Voss needed, and which Voss had come to understand was a rare skill, the ability to be present without demanding anything from the presence. They were 2 hours out from the facility when Kell came aft and handed Voss a flask without explanation. Voss took it, drank, handed it back. The contents were something fermented and sharp and not entirely legal under the Alliance provisions governing transit vessels. And Voss thought, yes, this too is the thing. Not the strategy, and not the archive, and not the sequence run from borrowed hands. This, the flask, the transit, the quiet, the being alive to sit in an aft compartment with people who trusted you enough to hand you something illegal and not make a speech about it. This is what the whole machinery is built to protect. This small warmth, this ordinary thing. Vo had known someone like that. He had lost her. He had spent the last months of his life trying to build a case that her loss was not simply a classified entry. Voss would make sure that the case got built, not because she had been asked to, not because it was strategic, because she carried his knowledge and she had chosen, consciously and with her whole self, to carry his purpose too. Because some things are worth carrying forward even when they don't belong to you, especially when they don't belong to you. The tribunal convened 4 months later. The archive was the primary evidence. The 2 surviving members of the command tier were located through a process Voss did not have full visibility into, which she accepted as the appropriate partition between intelligence work and justice work. She testified for 3 days. She answered every question about the Vathi neural archive with the same precision and the same steadiness. She described what she had experienced, the overlapping consciousness, the borrowed memories, the grief that was not hers and had become hers anyway. She described VO as a person, not an asset, not a source. A person who had known something wrong was being done and had tried to stop it and had failed and had, by accident or fate or the specific stubbornness of knowledge that refuses to die with the body that held it, succeeded after all. When the tribunal asked her, on the second day, whether she considered herself to have been compromised by the Vayathi neural archive procedure, she said, I consider myself to have been changed by it. I don't think those are the same thing. Everything that happened to me happened to me. I metabolized it. What I did with it was my decision. The knowledge was Vo's. The choices were mine. They asked her if she would do it again. Agree to the operation. Carry the archive. Use what it contained. She thought about the cold blue-white light of that corridor, the weight of the flask in the aft compartment, the name Saris, which appeared in no personnel file and which she would never be able to fully grieve because she had never known the person, only the shape of the absence, she said, "Yes, I would do it again. Because the thing that distinguishes us, and I mean humans specifically, not the Alliance, not any particular political structure, but humans as a kind of animal that has been walking upright and making decisions and burying its dead for a very long time. The thing that distinguishes us is that we don't have a protocol for leaving unfinished things unfinished. We pick them up. We don't always know why. We don't always ask if we're allowed. We just look at the thing that was dropped and we think, someone should carry that. And then we do. They gave her a commendation she didn't particularly want. She attended the ceremony because Chanel told her to, and because Chanel was right, that institutions need their rituals, and you can think a ritual is insufficient and still participate in it without betraying anything important. Afterward, in a corridor outside the ceremony hall, Chanel handed her coffee in a paper cup with the specific warmth of someone who has decided to make this a ritual of their own. Voss took it. They stood together in the corridor for a while, without saying anything, which had become their preferred mode of communication in the months since Caraveth, and which worked because it was built on 8 weeks of Chanel learning what Voss looked like when she was herself. Voss was herself. She was also, always, a little bit Vaux, his knowledge layered through hers, his grief absorbed into her own, and transformed into something functional. The way a scar is transformed from an injury into simply a part of the body, unremarkable in the daily navigation of being alive. She drank the coffee. She looked out a window at a star field that contained, somewhere in its indifferent expanse, a small sulphurous moon with a facility carved into its mantle and a medical observation bay where she had first understood what had been done to her. She thought about all the ways things could have gone differently, all the exits where the story might have ended, without the archive, without the tribunal, without any of it. Then she finished the coffee, handed the cup back to Chanel, and went back to work. There was still a great deal of unfinished business.